Hello everyone, this is Robin Pearson from the History of Byzantium podcast. Since you're learning about the Church Fathers, perhaps you'd also be interested to hear the story of how the Church itself survived the political storms that weathered the Eastern Roman world for the next millennium. If politics, war, and compromise are something that you're interested in, then check out the History of Byzantium podcast. Go to thehistoryofbyzantium.com or wherever you get your podcasts. For now, back to Mike.
Gaudeamus omnes in Domino.
I am going the way of the fathers, for I see myself being summoned by the Lord.
Sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers, a podcast sponsored by CatholicCulture.org. I'm your host, Mike Aquilina. Today we meet the first of our fathers who wrote in the Latin language. He's the first in this series anyway. Scholars quarrel about the dating of early Christian texts and which came first. The argument is as endless and insoluble as the chicken and egg riddle, and it can be every bit as boring. And today's author is one of those guys they love to argue about. But I won't engage it. I'll just dive into our discussion of the text. Because today's father is anything but boring. His name is Marcus Minucius Felix, and he was one of the great prose stylists of his time. Scholars of Latin literature make that judgment confidently, even though only one of his works has survived. That work is titled Octavius, and it is more than brilliant enough to carry a literary reputation through millennia. Minucius Felix was a lawyer from North Africa, but living and practicing law in the empire's capital, Rome. It's clear that he had a superb education. He wrote Latin with the style and verve of Cicero and Seneca. His Octavius is a work of dramatic fiction, and he wrote about a theme that everybody cares about: friendship. When I say that the Octavius is fiction, I don't mean it's purely imaginary, that it never happened. Indeed, it's likely that all three of its main characters were real people, and that the dialogue was reconstructed from the author's vivid memory of a real event. The names of all three characters have actually turned up in civic inscriptions, all found in North Africa, and all from the period in which the Octavius is set. The author himself, Minucius Felix, was actually a notable figure in his day, and his reputation survived him by at least a couple centuries. He was at the top of his profession, practicing law in the city whose laws governed the earth. He was a Christian, but that had not impeded his career. The anti-Christian laws were on the books, and Christianity was technically a capital crime. But Marcus seems to have lived during a lull between active persecutions. This happened intermittently. The emperors despised the Christians for their superstition, and popular opinion often favored active persecution. But with every decade, the Christians grew more numerous, and so they included an increasing number of people considered indispensable. In times of war, for example, the empire came to depend upon Christian soldiers, because Christian soldiers were reliably courageous. In times of epidemic, the major cities came to depend upon Christian doctors for the same reason. Minucius Felix was probably one of those indispensable men. His gifts were certainly extraordinary, and clearly, high among his gifts was friendship. He surely had many friends in high places. His two companions in the Octavius were also very important citizens. They were the kind, after all, who got their names carved into cornerstones that survived for millennia. Like Minucius Felix, they were public figures. The three characters in the story were the author himself, whose first name was Marcus, and his friends, Cecil and Octavius. The literary form of the drama is technically a dialogue. It's like the sparkling philosophical dramas of Plato and Cicero. It's a story of friends having a conversation and disagreeing vehemently and frankly, as only friends can, and needing to come to a resolution, as only friends can. We've seen the literary form already in Justin Martyr's famous Dialogue with Trypho, which was produced maybe a generation before the Octavius. Justin's dialogue is valuable for many reasons, which I won't repeat here, but in style it pales compared to the Octavius. Justin's dialogue is long, rambling, and prolix, and its style is clunky. The Octavius, on the other hand, is a masterpiece of the form. Critics still marvel at its turns of phrase, its pacing, the development of its characters, and the dramatic unfolding of its argument. Minucius Felix wrote with grace, refinement, and a certain sense of delight in his art form. The drama itself shows that he also took delight in conversation, in company, in argument, and in the exercise of professional excellence. From the start, he reveals his motivation for writing the dialogue. His close friend Octavius has died, and he feels a profound grief for the loss. As a remedy, he recalls a pleasant day he once spent with his friend years before. He writes, "When I think about what I remember of Octavius, my excellent and most faithful companion, the sweetness and charm of the man so clings to me that it almost seems as if I were going back into the past, and not merely recalling things that have long since happened and gone by. Thus, the longer it has been since I could actually see him, the more the thought of him is bound up in my heart and in my most intimate feelings. And thus, when my thoughts were traversing the entire period of our intimacy and friendship, my mind fixed itself chiefly on that time when by very weighty arguments he converted Cecil to the true religion." So he begins with a spoiler. Marcus begins by telling us how the story will end. It's a conversion story, but that's okay, because the narrative still overwhelms us with its charm. The plot is actually very simple. It's this: 2 Christians and a pagan go to the beach, and 3 Christians come back. And yet the scenery is precious because of its stunning sensory detail. After all these centuries, we almost forget that the ancient Christians were human beings. They loved to feel the breeze on a fine autumn day. They liked to go to the beach and feel the sand between their toes. They loved to skip shells across the water and see whose shell could go farthest. The Octavius is the only Christian document of its time that reminds us of all these beautiful things. In the course of the dialogue, we walk with 3 friends and colleagues, all of them attorneys, as they spend an autumn holiday at the beach resort of Ostia. Ostia was Rome's seaport, so it was a grand marketplace, a bazaar of sights and sounds and aromas. It had an excellent amphitheater, lavish public baths, and spacious parks and plazas. And of course, there was the ocean, where the waves caught the sun and the temperature at midday was just right for a dip. If you go to Rome today, you can take a train to Old Ostia, Ostia Antica, and you'll see that so many of those ancient monuments are still standing. The ocean is further out today than it was in the 2nd century, but even the ruins are captivating, and they confirm the sense of pleasure we get from Minucius Felix. "It was early morning," he says, "and we were going toward the sea along the riverbank, so that the gentle breezes might refresh our limbs, and the yielding sand might sink down under our easy footsteps with excessive pleasure, when Cecil, seeing an image of the god Serapis, raised his hand to his mouth and pressed a kiss on it with his lips. So Cecil is a pagan, and his 2 friends are Christians. His gesture of idolatrous worship brings all the pleasure of the moment down to the ground with a resounding crash. And a conversation begins. His friend Octavius cannot let the gesture go unrecognized and unchallenged. But he puts his challenge in terms of friendship. It would be wrong, he says, for two good men to stand by speechless while their friend wallows in the blindness of vulgar ignorance. He tries to get Marcus to join him in correcting their friend, Cecil. They continue their walk and take in the scenery. But Cecil is hurt and uncharacteristically quiet. When Marcus asks him about his silence, he states his wish that they do what lawyers do best: argue the matter out. And so they do. They make it like a day in court. Cecil is the prosecutor, stating the case against Christianity. Octavius responds for the defense, and Marcus stands as arbitrator and judge, deciding in the end which side has made the stronger argument. Though the Octavius is written by a Christian, the author allows the anti-Christian side to make its strongest case. Cecil begins by arguing in favor of skepticism and agnosticism. He says that nothing can be known with certainty. The best humans can do is gamble on probability. All the evidence in the world seems to indicate that there is no providence. Bad people prosper and good people suffer. Natural disasters have devastating effects, and everyone seems to suffer equally. He then goes on to make the case for respecting the Roman tradition. In a world marked by uncertainty, it is best, he says, to show humility and deference to the ways of our ancestors. They accomplished amazing things. They conquered the world, and so they have proven themselves to be reliable. So far, so good. He has till now simply defended the Roman tradition against Christianity, which was a newcomer on the scene in those days, hardly more than 100 years old. But then Cecil takes a turn for the nasty. He gives vent to every rumor, every urban legend, and every slur he has ever heard voiced against the Christians. He says they are atheists. He calls the church a secret society, possibly prone to sedition. He accuses believers of unbridled lust and habitual incest. He notes that the founder of Christianity was a criminal who died by capital punishment. He says that Christians believe in outlandish and superstitious fantasies like the resurrection of the flesh. They hate the world and look forward to its ending in flames. It would be best, Cecil concludes, not to mess with the established Roman order. The world is full of uncertainty, but Christianity offers no plausible solution, only absurdity. After a few words from Marcus, Octavius begins his calm rejoinder. He takes up Cecil's arguments one by one and answers them reasonably, serenely, defending the Christians not only by their own terms or with their own scriptures, but rather by frequent recourse to the philosophers of Athens and Rome. He notes that the philosophers, like Cecil, often voiced skepticism about the multiplicity of gods, but they also showed a tendency toward monotheism, the belief in one God. So did the poets. Octavius observes, moreover, that the world is not entirely chaotic, as Cecil had claimed. Nature keeps a certain order and follows a reasonable design. We can no more deny the existence of the Creator than we can deny the existence of the sun. He demonstrates, furthermore, that the accusations of sexual immorality are entirely fabrications. Christians do not worship monsters or devour infants or mingle in incestuous banquets. What's remarkable, though, is that many truly abominable things are practiced by the people of Rome and Greece and Egypt. Christians do not kill babies and eat them, as Cecil charged, but the people of all these nations regularly do murder their offspring through abortion and infanticide, practices that the Christians openly condemned and refused to practice. The horrors of the non-Christian world, moreover, are not merely known by rumor. They are facts, widely known. They can be confirmed easily. Cecil's argument contained a good bit of sense. but he was clearly bested by his friend Octavius. And even Cecil recognized he'd been defeated. In the end, he asks to become a Christian. The Octavius is widely considered to be the greatest work of the age of the apologists, at least in terms of its literary merit. It's a masterwork of the art of fiction and the ancient form of philosophical dialogue. As a Christian document, it's most unusual. It is clearly written not for Christians, but for Romans of the professional and noble classes, those who were well-educated, but usually misinformed about Christianity. The Octavius never mentions Jesus Christ by name. It never quotes from the Bible. It never approaches core doctrines, such as the Trinity, the Paschal Mystery, or the sacraments. It concerns itself mainly with morals, and with what we today would call natural theology. On the other hand, it does call as witnesses Socrates, Diogenes, Pythagoras, Democritus, Aristotle, and many others. Through the argument of Octavius, the dialogue shows that all the greatest ideals of Greco-Roman culture find their proper home only in Christianity. The philosophers themselves seem to testify to truths that only the Christians believe. As Octavius himself put it, either the Christians are now philosophers, or the philosophers were then already Christians. Minucius Felix writes as a former unbeliever. Both he and Octavius had been ardent opponents of Christianity in their youth. Both had participated directly in the interrogation and condemnation of Christians. Both had attempted to drive Christians to deny their faith. Yet his own backstory made him love his non-believing friends all the more. He knew firsthand that conversion was possible, even in the hard cases, and that reasoned discussion in the context of friendship was a good beginning to any conversion story. So he put that conversation into beautiful writing. He placed it in the most beautiful setting he knew, and he gave a sympathetic voice to the concerns of his most hostile opponents. He wanted to make them friends, and he wanted to make them Christians. We can hear his invitation even in the proposal of the pagan Cecil. Quote, "Let's sit down on those rocky jetties, the ones that run far out into the deep, so that we may be able both to rest after our journey and to argue with more attention." Unquote. I will confess to you that Ostia Antiqua is one of my favorite places on God's earth. It is a 4th century city dredged out of a swamp, largely intact. It's a ghost town from the time of the Church Fathers, so you can still walk its cobblestone streets and visit its taverns and enter its homes and go to its public baths and applaud in its empty amphitheater. But even if I had never been there before, I would love the place still, because Minucius Felix took me there, and he made it all the more lovely for the companionship he enjoyed there. The Octavius is more than an argument for Christianity. It's a meditation on friendship, and Christian friendship in particular. What does it mean for a Christian to have a non-Christian friend? Is it a problem or an opportunity? It's my firm belief that friendship was the most effective means of evangelization in the ancient world, and it's my firm belief that friendship remains the most effective means of evangelization today. More effective than any media program, any media platform, more effective than any diocesan program. The Octavius shows us how conversions happened in Rome and its suburbs in 150 AD. And how was that? Christians extended true friendship to a world that was starved for it. They went for long walks with their friends. They didn't shy away from difficult conversations. They listened, and they responded honestly. The world changed, one mind at a time, one heart at a time. Marcus Minucius Felix was a famous public figure in his day, and so were his friends Cecilius, Natalis, and Octavius Januarius. Today, however, all we know them for is their friendship. And I'll bet that Minucius Felix would say there could be no better memory and no better legacy. This week, I want to ask a favor of you. Please visit the History of Byzantium podcast if you haven't already, and give a listen. From the early episodes, you'll learn about the social and political context of events in Christian history from 476 onward. Byzantium was the eastern capital of the Roman Empire, and so its policies and personalities are integral to our understanding of the later fathers, from Gregory the Great to John of Damascus. Podcast host Robin Pearson manages a lot of nuance in a half-hour podcast, and he knows how to tell a good story. So do yourself a favor. Try the History of Byzantium podcast today. You'll find it at thehistoryofbyzantium.com.
De quorum solemnitate gaudent angeli et collaudant filium Dei.
Way of the Fathers is just one of the podcasts produced by CatholicCulture.org. To hear more from the Church Fathers in their own words, check out Catholic Culture audiobooks, readings of Catholic classics including the Fathers and St. John Henry Newman. And for interviews on a wide range of topics in Catholic arts and culture, listen to the Catholic Culture podcast.